She was just 5 years old when she gave away the only thing that mattered to her. But that single act of a child's heart would bring something to her family that no amount of gold could ever buy. Clarabelle clutched her worn cloth doll against her chest as she wandered through the tall grass behind their small cabin. The morning sun filtered through the scattered trees, casting long shadows across the meadow where she often played alone. Her bare feet moved carefully over the uneven ground, avoiding the sharp stones that dotted the path toward the creek. The sound reached her first, a soft whimpering, like a wounded animal might make. Clarabelle stopped, tilting her head to listen more carefully. There it was again, coming from somewhere beyond the thick cluster of oak trees near the water's edge. Her small heart began to beat faster, but curiosity pulled her forward. She pushed through the low branches and stepped into a small clearing. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. A girl, perhaps a year older than herself, sat huddled against the base of a large tree. Her long black hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and her clothes were different from anything Clarabelle had ever seen. Beaded patterns decorated the soft leather of her dress, and small feathers were woven into her hair. But it was the tears streaming down the girl's face that made Clarabelle forget everything else. The girl's dark eyes were wide with fear, and her whole body trembled as she looked up at Clarabelle with the expression of someone who had lost everything. Clarabelle approached slowly, the way her father had taught her to move around frightened animals. She knew without being told that this girl was from the native tribe that lived somewhere beyond the distant hills. Her parents had spoken of them in hushed tones, always with respect, but also with the careful distance that came from not understanding. The girl tried to back away, pressing herself harder against the tree trunk, but she had nowhere to go. Clarabelle could see scratches on her arms and legs, as if she had been running through thorny bushes for a long time. Her feet were bare and dirty with small cuts that suggested she had traveled far without shoes. Without hesitation, Clarabelle sat down in the grass a few feet away from the frightened girl. She looked down at the doll in her arms, the only toy she had ever owned. Her mother had sewn it from scraps of fabric during the long winter months, stuffing it with dried grass and sewing on button eyes with careful stitches. Clarabelle had named her Rosie, and she took her everywhere. The native girl's crying had quieted to small hiccups, but her eyes never left Clarabelle's face. There was something in those dark eyes that Clarabelle recognized, a loneliness that matched her own. Living so far from town, Clarabelle rarely saw other children, and when she did, they often seemed afraid of her family's simple way of life. Clarabelle held up her doll, showing it to the girl with a gentle smile. She pointed to herself and said clearly, "Clarabelle." Then she pointed to the doll and said, "Rosie." The girl watched every movement, her breathing beginning to slow. Understanding seemed to pass between them without need for shared words. Clarabelle scooted closer, holding out the doll with both hands. The girl's eyes widened in surprise, and she shook her head quickly, as if such a gift was too precious to accept. But Clarabelle pressed the doll into the girl's hands anyway, closing the small fingers around Rosie's soft body. For the first time, the native girl's face showed something other than fear. Wonder flickered in her dark eyes as she looked down at the gift, then back up at Clarabelle. The girl whispered something in her own language, words that sounded like music to Clarabelle's ears. Though she couldn't understand the meaning, she could hear the gratitude wrapped in those soft syllables. The girl clutched the doll against her chest just as Clarabelle had done moments before. They sat together in the clearing as the morning sun climbed higher, two children from different worlds sharing a moment that needed no translation. Clarabelle had never felt so sure about anything in her young life. Giving away Rosie felt as natural as breathing, as right as rain after a long drought. But as footsteps approached through the trees, Clarabelle had no idea that her simple act of kindness had been witnessed by eyes she never saw, and that news of what she had done was already making its way back to a village where such gestures were remembered for generations. The footsteps belonged to Ezra Whitmore, who had been searching for his daughter since discovering her empty bed that morning. His weathered hands pushed through the branches, and his eyes immediately took in the scene before him. Clarabelle sat peacefully beside a native girl who clutched something against her chest with desperate gratitude. Ezra's first instinct was to call out, to rush forward and pull his daughter away from what others might consider danger. But something in the stillness of the moment made him pause. He had learned to read situations carefully during his years on the frontier, and what he saw here was not threat, but connection. The native girl looked up at him with the same fearful expression she had shown Clarabelle, but she did not run. Clara Belle turned toward her father with a bright smile, as if introducing him to a new friend was the most natural thing in the world. "Papa," Clara Belle said softly. She was crying. She needed Rosie more than me. Ezra's throat tightened as he understood what his daughter had done. The cloth doll that Sarah had worked on for weeks, the toy that had been Clara Belle's constant companion, now rested in the arms of a child who looked as if she had been lost for days. He approached slowly, keeping his movements gentle and non-threatening. The native girl watched him with intelligent eyes that seemed older than her years. When he knelt down beside the children, she did something unexpected. She reached into a small pouch tied to her dress and pulled out something that made Ezra's breath catch. It was a carved wooden bird, no bigger than his thumb, decorated with tiny painted details that must have taken hours to complete. The girl held it out to Clara Belle with the same generous spirit his daughter had shown moments before. Clara Belle accepted the gift with reverence, turning the small carving over in her hands. The craftsmanship was unlike anything Ezra had ever seen, delicate and precise in ways that spoke of generations of skill passed down through careful teaching. "What's your name?" Clara Belle asked gently, but the girl only tilted her head, not understanding the English words. Ezra tried a few basic gestures he had learned from occasional encounters with traders, pointing to himself and saying his name, then pointing to Clara Belle. The girl seemed to understand, and after a moment of hesitation, she touched her chest and spoke a word that sounded like flowing water. The three of them sat in the clearing as the sun climbed higher, an unlikely group bound together by the simple exchange of gifts between children. But Ezra's experienced eyes had caught something else, something that made his chest tight with worry. Behind the trees, at the very edge of his vision, he had glimpsed the shadow of someone watching, someone who had seen everything that had transpired in this clearing and who had already melted back into the forest with the silence of long practice. As he helped both girls to their feet and began the walk back toward the cabin, Ezra wondered what kind of attention his daughter's kindness might have drawn, and whether that attention would prove to be blessing or burden for his family. Sarah Whitmore dropped the wooden spoon she had been stirring with when she saw her husband approaching the cabin with 2 children instead of 1. Her first instinct was maternal panic, but as they drew closer, she could see that Clara Belle was unharmed and actually seemed happier than usual. The native girl walked slightly behind Ezra, still clutching the cloth doll against her chest. Her steps were hesitant, as if she expected to be turned away at any moment. Sarah had heard stories from other settler women about encounters with the local tribes, most of them filled with fear and misunderstanding. But what she saw before her was simply a lost child, no different from any other frightened little one who needed care and comfort. "She's hungry, Mama," Clara Belle announced as they reached the porch, "and she's scared. Can she stay for breakfast?" Sarah looked into her daughter's earnest face, then at the native girl who stood with downcast eyes. The child's clothes were torn in several places, and there were smudges of dirt on her face that suggested she had been traveling alone for quite some time. Without hesitation, Sarah opened the cabin door wider. "Of course she can," she said gently. "Come inside, both of you." The native girl hesitated at the threshold, looking back toward the forest as if considering whether to run. But Clara Belle took her hand and led her inside, chattering softly about everything in the small cabin as if giving a tour to an honored guest. Sarah quickly set another place at their simple wooden table, filling a bowl with the porridge she had been preparing. The native girl ate slowly at first, then with increasing hunger, as if she had not tasted food in days. Clara Belle sat beside her, occasionally offering encouragement or pointing out interesting things around the room. "Where do you think she came from?" Sarah asked Ezra in a quiet voice as they watched the children eat. "The tribal village is at least 2 days' walk from here," Ezra replied thoughtfully. "She's either been traveling for a long time, or she's been lost for several days." As if sensing their conversation, the native girl looked up from her bowl. She spoke a few words in her own language, then pointed toward the distant mountains. Her expression was one of longing, mixed with fear, as if home was both what she wanted most and what she was most afraid of never seeing again. Clara Belle had been listening intently, and suddenly she stood up from the table. She walked to the window and pointed in the same direction the girl had indicated. "You want to go home," she said simply. The girl nodded, tears forming in her eyes again. She clutched the cloth doll tighter, as if it was the only thing anchoring her to this moment of safety. Sarah felt her heart clench at the sight. She had always imagined that if Clara Belle were ever lost and frightened, She would want someone to show her the same kindness they were offering this child. "We should take her back," Sarah said to Ezra. "Her family must be worried sick." But even as the words left her mouth, they all heard it, the sound of horses approaching, not at the frantic pace of a search party, but with the measured rhythm of people who knew exactly where they were going. The native girl's head snapped up, and her whole body tensed with recognition. She whispered something that sounded like a name, and for the first time since they had found her, hope flickered across her features. Ezra moved to the window and peered out toward the tree line. What he saw there made him straighten with surprise. 3 riders approached on painted horses, their movements fluid and confident. They wore the traditional dress of the local tribe, and even from a distance, Ezra could see that these were not ordinary tribesmen. These were elders, men of importance and authority, and they were coming directly toward his cabin with the purposeful air of people who had business to conduct. The native girl jumped up from the table and ran to the window, pressing her small face against the glass. When she saw the approaching riders, she let out a cry of joy and spoke rapidly in her own language, pointing excitedly at the lead rider. Ezra stepped onto the porch with his hands visible and empty, a gesture of peace he had learned from previous encounters. Sarah remained in the doorway with Clara Belle close beside her, while the native girl bounced on her toes with barely contained excitement. The 3 riders approached with dignity, befitting their obvious status. The man in the lead was older, with silver streaking his long black hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of wisdom earned through years of leadership. He wore ceremonial clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, and a necklace of carved bones rested against his chest. When they reached the cabin, the elder dismounted with fluid grace despite his age. The native girl ran toward him, still clutching Clara Belle's doll, and spoke in a rush of words that tumbled over each other in her excitement to explain what had happened. The elder listened carefully, his dark eyes moving from the child to the Whitmore family standing on the porch. His expression revealed nothing, but Ezra could sense an intelligence behind those eyes that was measuring everything he saw. When the girl finished her story, she held up the cloth doll, explaining something with animated gestures. The elder's gaze settled on Clara Belle, and for a long moment he studied the small girl who had shown such unexpected kindness to one of his people. He spoke to the native girl in their shared language, asking what sounded like questions. She answered eagerly, occasionally pointing to Clara Belle or to the doll in her arms. During their conversation, Ezra caught the word that sounded like the girl's name, repeated several times with obvious affection. Finally, the elder approached the porch. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented but clear, suggesting years of interaction with traders and settlers. "I am Dakota," he said with formal dignity. "This child is Ayanna, granddaughter of my sister. She wandered from our village 3 days ago during a storm." Sarah stepped forward slightly. "We're so glad she's safe. She seemed lost and frightened when our daughter found her." Dakota's eyes moved to Clara Belle, who still stood quietly beside her mother. "The child tells me of great kindness, of a gift given with pure heart." Clara Belle looked up at the imposing figure before her, feeling no fear, despite his intimidating presence. "She was crying," Clara Belle said simply. "Rosie makes people feel better when they're sad." The elder's weathered face softened almost imperceptibly. He knelt down to Clara Belle's level, bringing his eyes closer to hers. "You gave your treasure to ease another's pain. This is the action of a wise heart, even in one so young." He stood and spoke quietly to his companions, who had remained mounted but were watching the exchange with obvious interest. One of them nodded and urged his horse back toward the tree line, disappearing into the forest with the same silence with which they had arrived. "Your daughter has honored our people," Dakota said to Ezra and Sarah. "Such kindness creates bonds that last beyond the lifetime of those who forge them." But even as he spoke these words of gratitude, something in his manner suggested that this encounter was far from over. Dakota reached into a leather pouch at his side and withdrew something that made Sarah gasp softly. It was a small bracelet woven from what appeared to be precious metals and stones, delicate enough for a child's wrist, but clearly crafted with the skill of a master artisan. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said, holding it out toward Clara Belle. "She wore it when she was no older than you are now. It carries the protection of generations of wise women." Clara Belle looked up at her parents, uncertain whether she should accept such an obviously valuable gift. Sarah nodded encouragingly, understanding that refusing would likely cause offense. As Clara Belle extended her small wrist, Dakota fastened the bracelet with gentle hands. The metal felt warm against her skin, and the small stones caught the morning sunlight in ways that made them seem almost alive. "But there is more," Dakota continued, his voice taking on a formal tone that suggested ceremony. "A debt of honor has been created by your daughter's actions. Our people do not forget such kindness, and we do not leave it unrewarded." Ezra shifted uncomfortably. "That's not necessary," he said. Clara Bell didn't expect anything in return. She was just being kind. "Which is precisely why the debt must be honored," Dakota replied. "Pure kindness is the rarest gift one person can give another. To ignore it would dishonor both the giver and the receiver." He spoke again to the remaining rider, who nodded and began walking his horse in a slow circle around the cabin. Ezra watched this with growing unease, wondering if they were being evaluated for some purpose he didn't understand. Ayanna had been listening to the adult conversation while still holding tight to her new doll. Suddenly she tugged on Dakota's ceremonial shirt and spoke urgently in their language. Her words seemed to surprise him, and he looked down at her with raised eyebrows. "What is she saying?" Sarah asked, noting the change in his expression. Dakota was quiet for a moment, as if considering how to translate not just words but concepts that might not exist in the settler's world. "She says the white child has the eyes of one who sees beyond the surface of things. She believes your daughter has been touched by the spirits." Clara Bell tilted her head curiously. "What does that mean?" "Among our people, such insight is considered a great gift," Dakota explained. "Children who possess it often grow to become healers or wise counselors. Ayanna believes she recognized this quality in you the moment you appeared in the forest." The conversation was interrupted by the return of the rider who had left earlier. He approached Dakota and spoke quietly, gesturing toward the forest behind him. Whatever he reported seemed to confirm something the elder had been expecting. "The council has spoken," Dakota announced. "Tomorrow, when the sun reaches its highest point, we will return. What we bring will change the fortune of your family, but it will also change your place in this land." Ezra felt a chill of uncertainty. "What kind of change?" Dakota's expression remained unreadable. "Your daughter's kindness has opened a door that has been closed for many seasons. Whether you choose to walk through that door will determine the path your family takes from this day forward." He helped Ayanna onto his horse, and she waved goodbye to Clara Bell with obvious reluctance to leave her new friend. As the three riders prepared to depart, Dakota offered one final piece of information that left the Whitmore family staring after them in stunned silence. "The land you farm," he said simply, "sits at the center of territories that 3 tribes have claimed for generations. Until now, no agreement has been possible." As the riders disappeared into the tree line, Ezra and Sarah exchanged worried glances. Clara Bell's simple act of kindness had apparently set in motion events far beyond anything they could have imagined, and they had less than a day to prepare for consequences they couldn't begin to predict. That night, sleep eluded the Whitmore household. Ezra sat at the kitchen table long after dark, turning Dakota's words over in his mind like stones he was trying to polish smooth. The idea that their small homestead sat at the center of disputed tribal lands filled him with a mixture of fear and confusion. Sarah worked quietly beside the fire, mending clothes with hands that trembled slightly despite her efforts to appear calm. She had heard enough stories from other settlers about territorial disputes to understand that their family might be standing at the edge of something much larger than themselves. Clara Bell, however, slept peacefully in her small bed, the tribal bracelet glinting softly on her wrist in the moonlight streaming through the window. In her dreams, she played again with Ayanna in the forest clearing, sharing games that needed no common language to understand. When morning came, Ezra found himself checking the horizon repeatedly, looking for signs of the promised return. He went about his usual chores with distracted attention, his mind wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. "What do you think they meant about changing our place in this land?" Sarah asked as they prepared a simple breakfast. "I've been thinking about that all night," Ezra replied. "Could be they want to make some kind of arrangement about the farming rights, or maybe they're planning to ask us to leave. Would we go?" Sarah's voice was quiet, but the question carried the weight of their entire future. Before Ezra could answer, Clara Bell appeared in the doorway, fully dressed and wearing the bracelet from the previous day. "Are Dakota and Ayanna coming back today?" she asked with the excitement of a child anticipating the return of new friends. "Yes, sweetheart," Sarah said. "They should be here when the sun is highest in the sky." Clara Bell nodded solemnly, as if this was important information that required careful consideration. She spent the morning hours playing near the cabin, but her games all seemed to involve practicing sharing and gift-giving, as if she was preparing for another exchange. As the sun climbed toward its peak, the family gathered on the porch to wait. The anticipation felt different from the previous day's surprise. Now they knew something significant was coming, but the uncertainty of what that might be filled the air with tension. When the riders finally appeared, there were more of them. 5 mounted figures emerged from the tree line, moving in the same measured pace as before. Dakota rode in the lead with Ayanna seated in front of him, but the other riders included men Ezra didn't recognize. One of them led a horse with no rider, but instead of an empty saddle, the animal carried something wrapped in elaborate blankets. Whatever it was, it had been secured with great care and obvious reverence. As the group approached the cabin, Ezra could see that all of the riders wore ceremonial dress, suggesting that this visit carried far more significance than a simple return of thanks. The formal nature of their appearance made his chest tight with apprehension. When they stopped before the porch, Dakota dismounted with the same dignity as before. But this time his expression carried a weight that hadn't been there during yesterday's encounter. "The spirits have spoken through the council fires," he announced. "What we bring today will bind our peoples together in ways that have not been possible for many generations." But as he gestured toward the wrapped bundle on the pack horse, something in his manner suggested that this gift would come with responsibilities the Whitmore family had never imagined. 2 of the tribal elders carefully lifted the wrapped bundle from the pack horse and carried it toward the cabin with ceremonial reverence. As they unwrapped the elaborate blankets, what emerged took Sarah's breath away completely. It was a chest, carved from what appeared to be a single piece of dark wood, and decorated with intricate designs that seemed to tell stories in their flowing patterns. The craftsmanship was unlike anything the Whitmore family had ever seen, clearly the work of master artisans who had spent countless hours perfecting every detail. But it was what lay inside the chest that made Ezra's knees nearly buckle. Gold coins caught the sunlight like scattered stars, more wealth than he had seen in his entire lifetime. Mixed among the coins were precious stones, carved ornaments, and what appeared to be official documents written in multiple languages. "This represents the combined tribute from 3 tribal councils," Dakota explained, his voice carrying the weight of ceremony. "For generations, these tribes have been unable to agree on the territorial boundaries of this region. Wars have been fought, blood has been shed, and families have been divided." Clara Bell stepped closer to examine the beautiful chest, her young eyes wide with wonder at the elaborate carvings. She reached out to trace one of the designs with her finger, and several of the tribal elders exchanged meaningful glances. "Your daughter's act of pure kindness has been seen as a sign," Dakota continued. "The child who gave away her only treasure to comfort a stranger has shown the path toward peace that we have been unable to find through generations of negotiation." Ezra felt overwhelmed by the implications of what he was hearing. "I don't understand. What does Clara Bell's kindness have to do with territorial disputes?" One of the other elders stepped forward and spoke in accented English. "The spot where your daughter found Ayanna is considered sacred ground by all 3 tribes. For a child to show such pure compassion there, with no knowledge of its significance, has been interpreted as guidance from the spirits themselves." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "What are you asking of us?" "We are not asking," Dakota corrected gently. "We are offering. This chest contains enough wealth to secure your family's future for many generations. But more than that, it represents an agreement between the 3 tribal councils to recognize your family as neutral guardians of this disputed territory." The concept was staggering. Ezra tried to process what it would mean to be caught between 3 different tribal groups, responsible for maintaining peace in a region that had known conflict for decades. "The responsibility would not be yours alone." Dakota seemed to read his thoughts. "Council members from each tribe would meet here regularly to resolve disputes. Your role would be to provide neutral ground and to ensure that the spirit of your daughter's kindness continues to guide all decisions made on this land." Clara Bell had been listening with the serious attention that children sometimes bring to adult conversations they sense are important. "Would Ayanna be able to visit?" she asked. "Often." Dakota smiled for the first time since arriving. "The children of all 3 tribes would be welcome here. We believe that if the next generation can learn the lessons your daughter demonstrated, the conflicts that have divided us may finally heal." Ezra looked at Sarah, seeing his own mixture of hope and fear reflected in her eyes. The wealth in the chest would solve every financial worry they had ever faced, but the responsibility they were being offered carried risks he couldn't fully comprehend. "If we accept this," he said slowly, "what happens if the peace doesn't hold? What if the old conflicts return?" Dakota's expression grew serious again. "Then your family would be caught in the center of those conflicts. The position we offer brings great honor, but also great danger." As if to emphasize his words, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears again. But this time, the riders were not approaching with the measured dignity of tribal elders. These horses were moving fast, and there were many of them. The approaching riders belonged to the second tribal council, arriving exactly as Dakota had expected. Their leader dismounted and approached with formal dignity, speaking rapidly to Dakota in their shared language. Whatever he said seemed to confirm something important, because Dakota nodded with satisfaction. "The other councils have witnessed your daughter's bracelet," Dakota explained to the Whitmore family. "Word has spread through all 3 tribes about the child who showed such kindness to one of our own. They come now to add their blessing to this agreement." Within minutes, representatives from the 3rd Tribal Council also appeared, completing what Clara Bell realized was a very important gathering. She watched with fascination as the 3 groups of elders began speaking together in a mixture of languages, occasionally gesturing toward her family and the precious chest. Sarah stepped closer to Ezra, speaking quietly. "This is bigger than we ever imagined. Are we prepared for this kind of responsibility?" Before Ezra could answer, Clara Bell walked directly to the center of the group of tribal leaders. Her small voice carried clearly in the afternoon air. "I just wanted to help her because she was sad. I didn't know it would cause all this." The conversation stopped as every adult turned to look at the 5-year-old girl who had unknowingly set these momentous events in motion. Her simple honesty seemed to cut through all the formal ceremony and complicated negotiations. Dakota knelt down beside her once again. "Child, do you understand that your kindness has created the possibility for peace between peoples who have been fighting for many years?" Clara Bell considered this seriously. "Does that mean more children like Ayanna won't have to be scared and lost?" "That is exactly what it means," replied the leader from the 2nd Tribal Council. "If your family accepts our offer, this land will become a place where children from all tribes can play together safely." The image of children playing together without fear seemed to settle something in Ezra's mind. He looked at Sarah and saw the same resolution in her eyes. They had come to this frontier to build a better life for their daughter, and this opportunity offered more than they had ever dared to hope for. "We accept," Ezra said simply. The formal ceremony that followed would be remembered by all 3 tribes for generations. Documents were signed, blessings were spoken, and the chest of tribute was officially presented to the Whitmore family. But for Clara Bell, the most important moment came when Ayanna climbed down from Dakota's horse and ran to embrace her friend. As the 2 girls played together while the adults completed their historic negotiations, Clara Bell never imagined that this day would be remembered in tribal oral histories as the beginning of the Great Peace. She was simply happy to have her friend back, and to know that Ayanna would never have to be lost and frightened again. Years later, when Clara Bell had grown into a wise woman who helped resolve disputes between the neighboring tribes, she would still keep that carved wooden bird Ayanna had given her on their first meeting. It served as a reminder that the most powerful changes in the world often begin with the simple decision to share what you have with someone who needs it more. The homestead that had once been a small frontier cabin became a gathering place where 3 proud peoples learned to settle their differences through words instead of conflict. All because a 5-year-old girl believed that no child should cry alone in the forest. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale of courage and kindness in the frontier, where ordinary people discover extraordinary strength when faced with impossible choices. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.